Good morning, everybody. I'll just jump right in here. My talk is going to be on temptation, virtue, and the character of Christ. And this is a painting. You can't see it super well, but this is a painting by a French painter, James Tissot, Jésus tenté dans le désert. It's a picture of Satan tempting Jesus to turn stones into bread in the desert, in the wilderness. And we'll talk about that particular temptation experience. So I want to start, so that I don't forget to do this at the end, by acknowledging Will and the Beacon Project leaders, Mike and Angela and Christian, and the Templeton Religion Trust for their generous support of this project. I'm also grateful to the Air Force Academy, where I work, for giving me a little bit of time off from teaching to do this research. And I need to give a disclaimer that the views expressed in this presentation are my own and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. Air Force, the U.S. Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Neither do the views expressed here necessarily represent the official views of the Templeton Religion Trust. And I get to write that at the end of every paper I write. So I have to save lots of words in my word limit. So for the Beacon Project, I worked on two main strands of research on theology and the morally exceptional. I'm a philosopher by training, but I won one of the theology and the morally exceptional grants. And my two strands of research, the first one was on temptation and the virtuous, and that involved two primary papers. One is Resolving the Temptation-Virtue Paradox. That's the working title. I'm still revising that one. And then the second paper is on temptation, virtue, and the character of Christ, which is under review, and that's going to be the main focus of my talk this morning. The second main strand of research, which I won't say much about this morning, but I thought I'd put it up here for you just in case anybody wanted to talk to me about it later or during the Q&A, co-editing a book called Becoming Good, New Essays in Christian Ethics and Native Virtue Formation, a couple of papers there on emotion and becoming wise, cultivating Christian love, and then a couple of things there at the bottom that I've been sort of doing final work on during the Beacon Project grant period. So without further ado, this is a project on moral beacons, and the moral beacon that I'm going to focus on this morning is Jesus Christ. And according to the Christian tradition, I think there are two really primary features of Jesus and his moral character that are really important to focus on when thinking about his role as a moral exemplar or a moral beacon. And the first one is that he is considered to be perfectly virtuous. So here's just some evidence for that. Linda Zagzebski says, for Christians, Jesus Christ is the central paradigmatic good person. Sylvia Walsh, this is a little bit longer, says the notion of a specifically Christian moral character receives its normative definition and paradigmatic existential expression in Jesus Christ, who is viewed in the New Testament not only as the Redeemer of fallen humanity through his death and atonement, but also as the prototype and perfect model of human moral character. Brian Leftow says it's no stretch to suppose that Christ had no corrupt values. He was perfect in virtue. Similarly, Christian Miller, in his recent Character Gap book, says, from a Christian perspective, Jesus was a perfect person with a perfectly virtuous character. Christians are to model their lives after Jesus. And finally, to show that these folks are in good company of now long dead Christian theologians and philosophers, Thomas Aquinas similarly says, Christ had grace and all the virtues most perfectly. In Christ, the virtues were in their highest degree. Now, the second main point about Jesus' moral exemplarity, I think, is that he was tempted. The temptations of Christ are talked about in multiple places in the New Testament. Here's one example from Hebrews 4:15. It says, for we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Similarly, a couple chapters earlier in Hebrews, the author writes, for because he himself has suffered when tempted, he is able to help those who are being tempted. So the temptation is supposed to, at least for the author of Hebrews, play an important role in Jesus' ability to function as a moral exemplar for us, and that's going to be important later in my talk. In terms of the biblical evidence for the temptations, The desert temptations are a classic example. So this is an event in Jesus' life just prior to his public ministry, where we're told by the gospel writers that he's led into the desert by the Spirit to be tempted by the devil. Here's how the Gospel of Matthew starts off the story. Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil, and after fasting 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. No surprise. And the tempter came to him and said to him, "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become loaves of bread." He then goes on to tempt Jesus in two other ways, and Jesus resists those temptations. And then finally, I think we have to focus also on the temptation in the Garden of Gethsemane. So this is just prior to Jesus' crucifixion. Jesus goes into the Garden of Gethsemane on or near the Mount of Olives, and he prays to his Father, and he says this to the disciples who are with him: "My soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch with me." And going a little farther, he fell on his face and prayed, saying, "My Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will." And many in the Christian tradition, and it seems also the author of Hebrews takes the temptation to forego the cross as one of the primary temptations that Christ experienced in his life. So we have these two main features of Christ's moral character, moral exemplarity. He's perfectly virtuous. Nevertheless, he was tempted. So far, so good, but there is a bit of a wrinkle suggested by a Neo-Aristotelian thesis that says that virtue is equivalent to temperance, to a sort of broadly construed temperance. Now, Aristotle talked about temperance and thought that it was just related to bodily appetites, things like desires for food and drink and sex. But the Neo-Aristotelian tradition has taken temperance and treated it in a sort of broad way, thinking that it means more a sort of appropriate amount of desire for what's good, right? And this is greater than, so that little arrow there is supposed to be a greater than sign. Temperance is greater than continence or self-control. So the temperate person and the continent person do the same thing. They actually both do what's right. The self-controlled person always ends up doing what's right, as the temperate person does. The difference is that for the self-controlled person, it's hard, right? They struggle to do what's right. They actually have to impose some willpower in order to do what's right, whereas the temperate person does not, because the temperate person doesn't desire what they shouldn't in the first place. That's the distinction. Sometimes this view has been called the Harmony Thesis, and on this view, it seems, the virtuous person, the perfectly virtuous person, will not experience temptation. They may be able to be tempted in some external, sort of purely outward sense, but they're not going to actually have any kind of internal experience of temptation on this view. So here's how Philippa Foot puts it in her famous essay, Virtues and Vices. "The fact that a man is tempted to steal is something about him that shows a certain lack of honesty. Of the thoroughly honest man, we say that it never entered his head, meaning it was never a real possibility for him." Similarly, John McDowell, he puts this in terms of silencing. He says, "If a situation in which virtue imposes a requirement is genuinely conceived as such by the virtuous person, then considerations which, in the absence of the requirement, would have constituted reasons for acting otherwise are silenced altogether, not overridden by the requirement." So they're not even reasons to act, according to McDowell. The reasons that you would otherwise have for acting in some way that's contrary to a requirement of virtue. Susan Stark puts this explicitly in terms of temptation. She says the virtuous person is not even tempted by considerations that do tempt the ordinary run of humanity. Perhaps the virtuous person was once tempted like the rest of us, but she has now overcome these temptations through clear moral vision and accurate emotions. And then finally, our own Christian Miller says, "Being around better people helps to shield us from temptation. Our friends with moral character can encourage us to make good choices and not exert pressure to go along with the group in doing things that we will live to regret. Over time, the hope is our characters will be molded so that we just naturally want to make these good choices and seek out positive situations. Even when the role models are not around to encourage us, we will no longer find the problematic situations tempting anymore." So now we have three points before us. Jesus was perfectly virtuous, Jesus was tempted, and we've got this Neo-Aristotelian thesis that says the perfectly virtuous person doesn't experience temptation. Right? can't experience temptation. Their virtue precludes them from experiencing temptation. Well, that's a problem. Now, you could just reject the neo-Aristotelian thesis. Some are going to be inclined to do so. Some Christians are going to be inclined to do so. In order to avoid the inconsistency. I'm not. I'm sympathetic with the thesis, and I have done part of the work that I've been doing is focused on trying to define temptation, and here's how I've defined it. Temptation is desiderative perception of an opportunity to act contrary to a requirement of virtue. It's a bit complex, but essentially I think of temptation as essentially involving desire, and I think of desire as being perceptual. It's a kind of perception of value. When you desire something, you see it as good in and through your desire. You see it as attractive in some way. Some folks like John McDowell are going to prefer not to use the language of desire here. He thinks that there's a kind of affective perception of what's good and attraction to what's good that doesn't involve desire. He might call it something like orectic perception. That's the term that he uses. But at any rate, I think of temptation as involving this, right? When you're tempted to do something, right, you see that action as somewhat attractive. You see it as a partially desirable act, and I think this is precisely why the perfectly virtuous person doesn't feel tempted to act unvirtuously, because for the perfectly virtuous person, their desires and moral perception are steadier, clearer, and more accurate than the unvirtuous person's. The virtuous person never fails to see the opportunity to act unvirtuously for what it is. John McDowell uses the language of salience here, and I borrow that here in saying that the ways in which the action would violate a requirement of virtue is salient in the virtuous person's moral perception. It just sort of jumps out at her, right, in the right sort of way. That's part of what it is to be virtuous, is to have this very keen moral perception that just sees the opportunity to act unvirtuously as an opportunity to act unvirtuously. He sees it for what it is, right? That's the claim. I'm not going to spend a lot of time defending that claim this morning. That's the other paper. So I'm going to now quickly move on to how to reconcile the temptations of virtue to Christ. So if you go with me in thinking that there's something right about this neo-Aristotelian thesis, if you're at all sympathetic with this view, and if, as a Christian, you would be committed to the idea that Jesus was both perfectly virtuous and tempted, and even if you're not a Christian, if you just think that this is true of Jesus, that he was perfectly virtuous and yet tempted, there's an apparent inconsistency here. There's a tension here that we need to resolve, and here's one way that you might go about trying to resolve it. I call it the external testing without desire view, and then in parentheses I give the slightly more pejorative name, the no temptation view. I think this is pejorative because I think it's contrary to what the Bible says. Sometimes theologians, biblical scholars will point out that the term for to tempt, peirazo, can mean to tempt or to test in a sort of positive sense, right? Just sort of put to the test, right? Show whether something can pass the test, as opposed to actually appealing to any kind of internal temptation. I grant that, as an exegetical point, but I think that the Hebrews passages make it very clear that the temptations of Christ are supposed to somehow make him sympathetic with our weaknesses when we're tempted. It talks about him suffering in temptation, and that seems to suggest to me, at least, that there's something very, real internal going on here with Jesus. This isn't just merely a sort of outward test, and the gospel passages do that as well, right? The temptation, and I just think that a temptation that doesn't involve desire, based on my definition of temptation, it just is not a temptation at all, right? A silenced temptation, as I put it, using McDowell's terminology, wouldn't actually be a temptation. It would be something else. We might say somebody tried to tempt you. We might say it was an attempted temptation, but you didn't have the internal psychological experience of temptation, absent desire. Aquinas seems to actually agree with this. He says this about temptation: the temptation which comes from the enemy takes the form of a suggestion. So I think Aquinas agrees with me in rejecting this view. The temptation which comes from the enemy takes the form of a suggestion. Now, a suggestion cannot be made to everybody in the same way. It must arise from those things toward which each one has an inclination. Okay, so much for that view. Here's another. This is Richard Swinburne's view, the never tempted to do wrong view, I'm going to call it. The slightly more pejorative version of that name is the less than the best view, and you'll see why. This is what Swinburne says: God incarnate could have chosen at a time to allow himself to make his choice at that time under the influence of temptation to do less than the best. He would then have needed to fight against the temptation not to do that best action, and it would have been possible that he would yield to that temptation and done instead a less good action, and perhaps even a bad action, though certainly not a wrong action. My worry about that is that I actually worry that I'm misunderstanding Swinburne here, because my worry here is that Jesus' temptations were temptations to sin. And to sin, I take it, is always to do a wrong. I think that's fairly obvious, and I'm not sure why Swinburne thinks otherwise. So I may be misunderstanding him here, and if you think I am, you can help me out with that. But I'm just not, I just don't think that this is going to solve our problem either. So here's my hypothesis. My hypothesis, my attempted solution to the puzzle here, is to say that Jesus Christ, while perfectly sinless in his human nature, was not fully virtuous in his human nature when tempted. Rather, he grew in virtue through overcoming temptation. I do think by the end of his life, he had achieved perfect virtue. So in that sense, I'm consistent with the traditional view in thinking that Jesus was the perfectly virtuous person, in fact, the only one. But I think that if the traditional view holds that he was perfectly virtuous throughout his life, that I find troubling. And here's why. Here's some reasons for thinking that Jesus Christ grew in virtue in his human nature. I'm trying to bracket divine nature worries here. Perfect in virtue, whatever that might mean for the divine nature. I think we can say that all of that is compatible with what I'm going to say. Tim Paul has a great book arguing for lots of ways in which one might do this. So I'll just punt on those issues for now, but you can challenge me with them in the Q&A. So the first reason for thinking that Jesus grew in virtue in his human nature is the biblical witness. So in Luke 2:52, we read that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. Wisdom, it seems to me, is a virtue, and it seems to me that if you can grow in wisdom, you can grow in virtue. That's a fairly quick argument. There are other ways to read that passage, but it does seem to me to be a natural reading of the passage to think that Jesus actually did grow in virtues. Now here's a slightly longer passage from Hebrews that I think is worth taking just a little bit of time on. For every high priest chosen from among men is appointed to act on behalf of men in relation to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, since he himself is beset with weaknesses. Now, right now the author of Hebrews is talking about the human high priests, right? The sinful high priests who are beset by sins, right? He can deal gently with the ignorant and wayward, he says, because he is beset with weaknesses. Because of this, he is obligated to offer sacrifices for his own sins, just as he does for those of the people. And no one takes this honor for himself, but only when called by God, just as Aaron was. So also Christ did not exalt himself to be made a high priest, but was appointed by him who said to him, "You are my son, today I have begotten you." In the days of his flesh, Jesus offered up prayers and supplications with loud cries and tears to him who was able to save him from death, and he was heard because of his reverence. Although he was a son, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. Now again, I don't think that there's only one way to read the terminology in this set of verses here, but I think that the gist of the passage is that the writer of Hebrews is trying to write to the early Christians and saying, look, just like the high priests of old were able to deal gently with you because they were beset with weaknesses, so too Jesus, as the perfect high priest, is able to deal gently with you because of his weaknesses, right? Yet, he learned obedience through what he suffered, and being made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation to all who obey him. I think that at least suggests the possibility of growth in virtue for Jesus. That's the first reason. The second reason for thinking Jesus grew in virtue is that virtue requires a high degree of psychological maturity, including certain well-developed skill-like capacities, for example, the kind of moral perception I described earlier, that it does not seem psychologically possible for a human child or young adult to possess. John McDowell notes this in his work, not with reference to Jesus, but just in terms of the virtuous person. He said, "This view of virtue obviously involves a high degree of idealization. The best we usually encounter is to some degree tainted with continence. But in view of what genuine virtue is, idealization is not something to be avoided or apologized for." I think also here what's relevant is what's called the Chalcedonian symbol, or the Chalcedonian definition. So this is one of the key documents, the key statements about Christology that was codified in one of the early councils of the Christian church. The Council of Chalcedon in AD 451, they said this about Jesus: "Therefore, following the Holy Fathers, we all with one accord teach men to acknowledge one and the same Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, at once complete in Godhead and complete in manhood, truly God and truly man, consisting also of a reasonable soul and body, of one substance with the Father as regards his Godhead, and at the same time of one substance with us as regards his manhood, like us in all respects, apart from sin." Now, I think if we can distinguish perfect virtue from perfect sinlessness, then to be like us in all respects except for sin might include growing in virtue. And I'm going to suggest that we can make that distinction. And then lastly, Gregory of Nyssa, who's one of the key theologians present at the Council of Chalcedon, says this: "Now everything we see included in the good is fitting to God. In consequence, either our opponents must show that the birth, the upbringing, the growth, the natural advance to maturity, the experience of death and the return from it are evil, or else if they concede that these things fall outside the category of evil, they must of necessity acknowledge that there is nothing shameful in what is alien to evil." So the natural advance to maturity, I think, is what I'm thinking might have involved a growth in virtue. Qualification, yes. So there's an important qualification here. I think my view that is consistent with the claim that Jesus was as perfectly virtuous as human nature makes possible at every stage of his psychological development. I actually think that's consistent with everything that I've said up to this point. He might have been less than perfectly virtuous, but as perfectly virtuous as, say, a 12-year-old could be. And then the last reason for thinking Jesus grew in virtue is that it is largely through struggling to overcome temptation, I think, that we grow in virtue, that we actually become virtuous. This might actually be a prerequisite of owning the virtues yourself, is that you've struggled through temptation to own them. So here's what Bob Roberts says in his paper, Willpower and the Virtues. "The virtues of willpower are needed not only for their corrective function, but also because they are essential to the development of the agent's agenthood. Struggles are an important part of the way we become centers of initiation of actions and passions. They are the contexts in which the shape of our personality takes on that toughness and independence which we call autonomy, and which seems to be a basic feature of mature personhood." So perhaps, absent struggling through a temptation experience, struggling to overcome and resist temptation, Jesus couldn't really have owned the virtues, really had them as his own, really sort of developed that toughness and independence, which we call autonomy, again, in his human nature. But there's an obvious worry here for the Christian, right? The doctrine of Christ, the traditional doctrine of Christ, and the biblical texts undergird this, says that Jesus was perfectly sinless. And in fact, many Christians have believed that Jesus was not just perfectly sinless, but impeccable. In other words, he was unable to sin. He couldn't have sinned, right? It was actually impossible for him to have sinned. So when he was tempted, sinning wasn't really an option on the table, right? That's the impeccability view. And so if you think that, right, if you think that he's perfectly sinless and, in fact, maybe even unable to sin, you might worry that my view has just undermined that my view has just contradicted that. And so here's one way of putting the worry. This is by Tim Paul and Kevin Tempe. While Christ grows in wisdom and stature, we do not think it is consonant with the traditional view to claim that he grows from lacking virtue or being able to sin to having virtue and being unable to sin. And I grant that it is not consonant with the traditional view to say that he lacked virtue, because the traditional view holds that he was perfectly virtuous. But I think what I want to make sure to distinguish is this idea of lacking virtue and being able to sin. I want to say those might be two different things. So my reply is that the traditional view has it that Jesus Christ is perfectly sinless, impeccable, and perfectly virtuous. My hypothesis is that he achieved perfect virtue in his human nature only in his adult, and perhaps just prior to his crucifixion. But I maintain that this is consistent with him being impeccable throughout his life. So for this, I think we need to distinguish sinlessness from virtue. And I want to say that whereas sinlessness is the state of having not fallen short, perfect virtue is the state of having achieved the heights of human excellence. Sin, I take it, is a violation of God's law, and I think lacking some of the skill-like aspects of virtue does not, to me at least, seem sinful. It doesn't seem sinful to lack the sort of really acutely attuned moral perception, say, that virtue requires, the kind I just described earlier. Also, here's another quick biblical argument, the Adam and Eve argument. According to the Genesis account, Adam and Eve were without sin prior to the fall, but their fall, and if the Neo-Aristotelian Harmony Thesis is right, their experience of the temptation of Satan in the Garden of Eden reveals that they were not perfect in virtue at that time. So I think, again, sinlessness might be a different thing than perfect virtue. Now, none of this is to say that Jesus wasn't an incredibly impressive moral exemplar, right? To be sinless even for a day, let alone a lifetime, is a really amazing moral achievement. I'm just suggesting that maybe that's consistent. Even being sinless over a lifetime might be consistent with developing and growing in virtue throughout that lifetime. I think we might have two different categories here of moral excellence: perfect sinlessness and perfect virtue. And I'm suggesting that those two categories of moral excellence might actually come apart. And maybe Jesus is the only one who's ever actually achieved either one perfectly. Right? Perfect sinlessness and perfect virtue, but I still want to say maybe those two things can come apart, and I think the traditional Christian view has maybe not seen those two as clearly distinct as perhaps they are. So I'll leave with a couple of thoughts here about the value of Jesus Christ as a sympathetic exemplar of virtue formation. So Paul explains that Christians ought to rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope. Sylvia Walsh quotes this and then goes on to say that there is therefore an intimate connection among temptation, testing, suffering, endurance, and the formation of character in the biblical writings that provides the basis for philosophical and theological reflection on temptation and moral character. Jesus is supposed to be our example of this, but I think that only works if Jesus actually developed his character through his temptation experiences. If he's actually our example of virtue formation through temptation and not just our example of perfect virtue. And as the writer of Hebrews took great pains to emphasize, the thought that Jesus might actually be able to sympathize with our weaknesses of character while tempted is a very encouraging thought. So one last takeaway is that here's one about how to follow Jesus as a moral exemplar. Situationism suggests that the best we can do to improve morally is to learn to avoid tempting situations. See, for example, John Doris's lack of character here. Christian Miller cites this strategy as his selecting our situation strategy, right? Just try to avoid tempting situations, right? And I think that's good advice as far as it goes. But what this study of Jesus as a moral beacon suggests is that even if Christ's moral character was perfected through overcoming, resisting temptation, then we should expect to have to overcome and resist temptation in our efforts to grow in virtue as well. If my hypothesis is correct, though, those of us who follow Jesus can take comfort in knowing that we can look to him as a truly sympathetic moral exemplar who experienced what it is like to face temptation with less than perfect virtue, yet without sin. So in other words, maybe, in order to become perfectly virtuous, if Jesus had to go through temptation to do it and struggle to resist and overcome temptation, maybe we will too, and so maybe just avoiding temptation isn't going to be enough. Maybe we need to combine that with facing temptation sometimes So the last thing I'll leave you with is a quotation from this famous work of Christian devotion, The Imitation of Christ by Thomas à Kempis. It says, "Temptations are often very good for a person, granted that they are troublesome and unpleasant, for through them one is humbled, cleansed, and instructed. All the saints have passed through many trials and temptations and have profited from them. Many people try to escape temptations, as the situationist maybe suggests that we should, then fall more severely into them. We cannot win by running away, but by patience and true humility we become stronger than all our enemies. The person who only runs away from temptation and does not tear it out by the root does not gain very much. In fact, for such a person, temptations will quickly return, and they will even be worse. If you patiently put up with them, you will gradually overcome your temptations better through God's grace than by your own harshness and self-assertion." Thanks.
Christ the exemplar of virtues to the greatest degree. At what point did he become perfectly virtuous? You said that it must have been after his temptation, but you also cited Gethsemane as one of his temptations. So is it the case that when we're looking at Christ's earlier life, prior to the instances before his death, he's not really perfectly virtuous there, and so we're looking for an exemplar, we should really be looking at sort of the last day of his life?
Yeah, that worries me a little to say that he actually wasn't perfected in virtue until, the Garden of Gethsemane, or maybe even on the cross. I mean, gosh, wow. So we don't actually ever see him perfect in virtue except right before he dies and then in his resurrected body. That concerns me. It does seem to be where my view pushes me. And here's the only thing that makes me feel a little bit more comfortable about suggesting that as a hypothesis is this. It's that I want to say it wasn't perfect in virtue, but really darn virtuous, like way better than you or I are ever going to be. So, I mean, super virtuous, right? But maybe not yet perfect in virtue. Stephen Davis, a philosopher who does a lot of work on the incarnation, he suggested to me he's not sure that the concept of perfect virtue is even really a coherent concept at all. And so I think this is actually pushing maybe in that direction. But what I want to say is, that's where my view pushes me, is to say that maybe he wasn't perfect in virtue, but maybe overcoming the fear of death is such a quintessential human temptation that maybe it's not possible to perfect virtue in life until faced with death. I don't know. Maybe. I mean, that's a hypothesis I'm willing to consider, too. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. Yes. There's a sense in which I like the view of growth in virtue for Christ. In the following sense, he can grow in knowledge, in some sense, with acquired knowledge. If virtue is just a type of skill, in the sense that he can grow in skill. So I can see why you might think that. My worry is with your definition of temptation. I know you said you were assuming it for argument's sake, so I don't want to say don't do that, because you're supposed to, you can assume whatever you want to for argument's sake. Right? But I was wondering about what Dave was asking, and it seems to me we shouldn't want to say the following, that any other mere human is a better moral exemplar for us than Christ is, at that same age maybe. So no other 33-year-old should be a better moral exemplar for me than Christ at 33. And I think you wanted to say that because you said that he's as good as any 12-year-old could be. And I imagine that goes not just for 12-year-olds, but also for 33-year-olds when he's 33. My worry, though, is this. When he's facing the temptation of Gethsemane, he feels a temptation, you say, and it's a temptation to act contrary to virtue, as you put it. But we have plenty of instances in Christian tradition of folks who are met with martyrdom, and they don't feel the same sort of temptation. Or at least the eyewitnesses tell us they don't. The saints go, where they say things like, let my flesh be rent by the lions as the bread of God, or something crazy like this. And you see this all the time, or many times with the early martyrs. So to put it all together in an argument, if your theory of temptation is correct, and it's true that we shouldn't want anybody else to be a better moral exemplar than Christ, you have a problem, because there are these guys who would be better moral exemplars than Christ. What do you think?
I think that's a fascinating argument. One I had obviously not thought of. That's good. I initially, here's what I might say in response. What I might say is, well, even if the martyrs faced death with a bit more with a bit more ease, let's say, right, than Jesus appears to have, he still is going to come out as the better moral exemplar given the whole of his life, the whole of his virtue, right? I mean, the martyrs are still beset by sin in all kinds of ways and not perfectly virtuous in all kinds of ways, even at their death. So I don't actually think the fact that they're facing death with some greater amount of ease than Jesus appears to have suggests by itself that they're a better moral exemplar. I am sympathetic with the worry, though. I do think there's an interesting worry here, though. And another thing that I might say in response to that is that maybe Jesus had more reason to be upset about his death than they did. Maybe for Jesus, dying was a worse thing than it is for them, because for Jesus, I'm trying to remember who I read say this, but for Jesus, it's a worse thing to die, right? This is what Aristotle says about the virtuous person and courage, right? The virtuous person fears death in the appropriate sense, right? Because they recognize it's sort of worse for them to die because they're so virtuous, right? Than it is for people who are less virtuous to die. That's a worse evil in the world, right? And so maybe there's something like that going on here, where for Jesus it just really is worse because he's perfect, because he's God's son. Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'll think about that some more, though.
So I really enjoyed your talk. And I guess my question sort of piggybacks on the first two questions. So in your view, how do you characterize what Jesus said on the cross, like why have you forsaken me, right? Because it seems like, so I'm a novice in all this stuff, but it seems that one thing that's confident about what he said is that he's acknowledging that suffering is hard, right? There's no Pollyannish outcome to suffering, right? But in your view, does that count as a failure of virtue, given that he's expressing doubt?
No. So there, somebody correct me if I'm wrong about this, but I believe he's quoting Psalm 22. Is that right? Psalm 22? Yeah, on the cross. And if you read Psalm 22, it starts out with, I believe it's a Psalm of David, and David is saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? And then he goes on to say in that psalm, but nevertheless, I'm going to praise you. I feel like you're abandoning me, and yet nevertheless, I'm going to continue to follow you. I'm going to continue to worship you. And so I actually think that we have to take Christ's words on the cross in light of that context from the psalm. I think he is quoting the psalm, and I think in quoting the beginning of the psalm, we should take him to be quoting the whole psalm, right? Surely Jesus knows what comes next in the psalm. And so by sort of saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's sort of, I think, praying the prayer that David prayed and saying, I'm feeling at this moment rejected by my Father. I'm feeling at this moment abandoned in my time of need. And yet, I know that God is faithful, and yet I know that my Father has my good in his heart, right? That's what he wants, right? So I think I don't take his words on the cross to be a sort of throwing up my hands and saying, well, I guess this isn't working out the way it was supposed to, or something. But rather as a statement that as a sort of proclamation of his unwavering commitment to obey his Father, even in the midst of, as hard as it seems right now at this moment, as hard as it feels, even as much as I feel abandoned at this moment, I'm not going to let myself give in to the temptation to think that I am, right, to sort of judge that I've been abandoned. I don't know if that helps answer the question, but I don't take that to be a failure of virtue there. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. I thought it was really interesting. A lot of interesting issues. So I think I'm wanting just a little bit of clarification on your view about the temptation. It seems to me like we could distinguish between two different kinds of temptation. So one kind of temptation is where you have some sort of desire or attraction to something vicious, and you're tempted to act on that desire or attraction. And that seems like what you're thinking of as temptation. But another sort of temptation is where you're tempted to have it, like you're tempted to see something as desirable. You don't actually have any attraction or desire to it, but you're tempted to sort of acquire that.
Yeah.
attraction. And the latter sort of temptation seems to me somewhat compatible with being perfectly virtuous. Like, even someone who's perfectly virtuous could be tempted to become less than perfectly virtuous by being tempted to see something as desirable that they don't currently see as desirable.
Okay.
So I don't know. I'm wondering what you think about that.
I think what I would say about that is, would it actually be contrary to, as McDowell puts it, would it be contrary to a requirement of virtue to see it as desirable? If it would, then I do actually think that we have a temptation in my sense. If it wouldn't be contrary to virtue to see it as desirable, to be tempted, in other words, in my sense, right? Then would the temptation to be tempted, to allow yourself to be tempted, be a problem? No, I actually think maybe something like this is going on in Swinburne's view when he says Jesus sort of sees it as good, right? The Son of God sees it as good to put himself in a situation where he might be tempted too, right? And I just want to say, well, it depends on whether that being tempted to counts as being virtuous or unvirtuous. If it's actually unvirtuous to be tempted to, then we're back in the same problem, I think. If it's not unvirtuous to be tempted to, then I want to say, yeah, I don't really want to call that a straightforward temptation. I want to call it something else. Now, I do think that there might be room to broaden my view here and say that maybe temptation doesn't always have to involve desire, if you go with McDowell in thinking that, like, you could have some kind of affective perception, value perception of something that doesn't involve desire, right? But I'm open to that. I'm not actually committed to saying that it always has to be desire. I know my definition says that, but I'm sort of open to the possibility that it could be evaluative perception that doesn't involve desire. But I would still call that a temptation, yeah.
Thanks. So I have a question about your argument that's like, hey, Jesus is like us and everything but sin. So that means he must be like us in lack of virtue. Well, here's another thing that humans have besides sin is like the tendency to experience guilt, or that we experience guilt, or shame, or we have a disposition to seek forgiveness and repent. It seems like Jesus didn't do those things. And so, like, if that's fine, then I think your argument for he's like us in everything but sin loses motivation, because here's another thing, he's not like us.
That's a great question. Yeah, you have to be really careful with these kinds of arguments. Sometimes people do this with, like, the Hebrews 4:15 passage, right? Tempted in every way as we are, yet without sin. Oh, does that mean he was tempted to shoot a gun at his neighbor, right? No, all right. They didn't have guns. So you're right. I have to be really careful here about that. He's like us in every respect except for sin, and try to make that mean that, he grew up in California like I did, or some ridiculous thing like that. But you're pointing to more sort of universal features of human experience, like the experience of guilt, the experience of shame, or other things that you have to be careful. Like us in every respect, what does that actually mean, right? How far can we extend that category? Here's what I would say in response to that. I actually have thought about this, and I do think that the claim that he's like us in every respect, apart from sin, might include the growth in virtue without having to include all these other ancillary things that you might think are pretty universal features of human nature. Because obviously he didn't have a sin nature like us, right? If you think humans have a sin nature. But here's why. It seems to me that it's very strange to say something like he's like us in every respect apart from sin, if as an 8-year-old child he had the psychological maturity of a fully virtuous adult. It doesn't seem to me strange it doesn't sound strange to my ear to say he's like us in every respect apart from sin if he also didn't have some other things that are pretty universal features of human experience, like guilt or shame or something. But if as an 8-year-old child he possessed the kind of psychological maturity that Aristotle has in view in the virtuous person, right? That now that's starting to stretch credulity for me beyond the breaking point, right? Now I'm starting to think that doesn't sound like he's like us in every respect apart from sin. That sounds like there's now we're talking about the incarnation of God. We're talking about God the Son taking on human nature, becoming human. So, I mean, these things are complex, right? It's difficult, but I just I'm inclined to think that a natural reading of that creed, that council, right, like the Chalcedonian definition suggests maybe something more. The natural advance to maturity, as Gregory of Nyssa put it, seems to me to be something that's just essential to being human, fully human. And I want to maintain that Jesus was fully human without denying that he was fully God. And I think being fully human might include growing in virtue.